The taste of copper coats your tongue. It is the chemical signature of a system under shear. On the horizon, the signal fires remain unlit, not because of peace, but because the fuel reserves have been liquidated. You hear the rhythmic thud of empty cargo hulls knocking against the stone quays, a hollow sound that vibrates through the harbor floor. The flow of grain has stopped. The friction of hunger begins to heat the streets. In the silence of the granaries, you can hear the dry rustle of empty husks, the sound of a multi-continental metabolism starving in real time. This is the Bronze Age collapse, the world's first internet failure. This system was an impenetrable web of 5 superpower empires, Hittite, Mycenaean, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Assyrian, welded together by a high-speed logistical network that stretched from the tin mines of Afghanistan to the copper pits of Cyprus. Its core function was the precise, synchronized exchange of specialized raw materials required to forge bronze, the period's only high-performance technology. For 3 centuries, this hyper-connected machine moved the ingredients of power with the efficiency of a fiber optic cable, making total isolation a physical impossibility. As the first nodes fracture, the empires respond by tightening the knot. They pump more gold into the hands of mercenaries. They cannibalize their own seed grain to pay for the energy draw of defensive walls. Each king demands higher pressure from his subjects to maintain a trade flow that has already begun to hemorrhage. They do not simplify, they add layers of complexity, creating more administrative friction to track dwindling resources. The energy cost of preserving the network begins to exceed the caloric output of the land itself. The system is no longer a tool for survival, it has become a predatory heat engine, consuming its own structural integrity to keep the trade routes open for one more day. You are currently breathing inside a global lattice that is more integrated, more efficient, and therefore more flammable than the one that liquidated 5 civilizations in 30 days. The transition from stone to bronze was not an evolution, it was a surrender to logistics. Bronze is a chemical contradiction that requires 2 metals that almost never exist in the same geography. To forge a single blade, you must marry copper from the Mediterranean with tin from the Hindu Kush. This physical requirement forced the creation of a high-velocity trade network, a prehistoric internet where information, grain, and metal flowed through a singular, optimized channel. This connectivity was the system's greatest efficiency, allowing empires to grow beyond the caloric limits of their local soil. But it also turned distance into a weapon. In the workshops of Hattusa and Thebes, the smell of charcoal and molten metal is constant. The furnace requires a specific temperature to fuse the alloys, a thermal threshold that mimics the societal threshold. As long as the tin flows, the system expands. But the efficiency of this specialization creates a lethal trade-off. No single empire is self-sufficient. By optimizing their economies for the international trade of bronze, these empires liquidated their internal resilience. They stopped growing diverse crops and began growing cash commodities for export. They traded the safety of the silo for the speed of the ship. The pressure within this system is maintained by the constant movement of the data, the ships. If one port clogs, the heat of the delay radiates through the entire lattice. Because the empires have specialized, they have no buffer. There is no local backup for the tin supply. There is no secondary technology to replace the bronze. The system has become a high-performance machine with zero redundancy. We see this today in the just-in-time delivery of our own essential components. The moment the friction of the real world, a storm, a drought, a localized revolt, slows the flow, the energy cost of waiting begins to hemorrhage the empire's treasury. The system survives this initial friction by increasing the speed of the remaining routes, pushing the remaining nodes to a physical breaking point they were never designed to sustain. The pressure of the entire global lattice converges on a single point beyond the reach of any pharaoh or king, the tin mines of the Hindu Kush and Cornwall. To keep a Mycenaean army shielded Uran. Egyptian palace functional, the flow of tin must traverse thousands of miles of hostile terrain and volatile waters. This is the mechanism of extreme dependency. Every gram of metal moved is a unit of energy extracted from the labor of tens of thousands. When a single node in the remote highlands fractures due to seismic shifts or local insurgencies, a silence begins to spread along the trade veins like a spreading necrosis. The shortage does not manifest as a sudden stop, it begins as an escalation of economic friction. The price of tin hemorrhages the treasuries, forcing empires to liquidate assets to secure the remaining shipments. They add more guard towers, commission more warships, and press more laborers into service just to keep the arteries from clogging. This is the complexity trap. To save the flow of matter, they must drain their internal energy reserves. The furnaces begin to cool, not for lack of fire, but for lack of the catalyst. A dry, metallic taste fills the mouths of the administrators as they realize the efficiency of the global network has become a noose. The system responds by attempting to substitute tin with inferior alloys, but this only increases the physical fragility of the civilization. Blades fracture upon impact, agricultural tools dull after a single harvest. This degradation of material quality leads to a catastrophic drop in labor productivity. As the core technology is cannibalized, the entire superstructure of the empire begins to groan under its own weight. We are witnessing a thermodynamic collapse. The system is consuming more energy to maintain its existence than it is capable of generating from its environment. The system survives this shock by rationing its capacity. But in doing so, it liquidates the very muscular tissue required to withstand the coming storm. The failure of the tin route creates a chemical vacuum in the heart of the Mediterranean. Without the alloy, the Mycenaean palace economies, highly tuned, fragile engines of redistribution, begin to stall. The mechanism of collapse is not a single blow, but a synchronization of deficits. When the first city-state fails to pay its mercenaries or feed its administrative class, it doesn't just disappear, it becomes a source of systemic contagion. The unemployed military class and the starving peasantry turn into sea peoples, displaced human shrapnel that the system itself accelerated into existence. As these displaced groups hemorrhage across the coastlines, they do not just raid, they liquidate the infrastructure of the next node. They burn the granaries and sever the local trade lines, forcing the next empire to increase its defensive energy draw. The Hittite Empire, already struggling with internal crop failures, finds its borders under mechanical stress. It requests grain from Egypt, drawing on the last reserves of the Nile. This is the connectivity trap. In its final phase, the empires are so tightly coupled that they are pulling each other into the abyss. They are attempting to stabilize a sinking ship by tethering it to 4 other ships that are already underwater. The psychological cost manifests as a paralyzing loss of trust in the network. The administrative data, the clay tablets recording debts and inventories, stop being updated. The scribes, the human CPUs of the Bronze Age, flee as the heat of the burning archives reaches the streets. The system can no longer process the information required to manage its own complexity. It is a total CPU lockup. The empires are no longer trading for bronze, they are trading for survival. But the currency of survival is precisely what the system has spent the last 3 centuries liquidating. The system survives this stage only in the most peripheral zones, as the core centers of power begin to fracture into unrecoverable dust. When the trade routes fracture, the language dies. In the Mycenaean world, writing, specifically linear B, was not a tool for poetry or history, it was a forensic accounting mechanism. It existed solely to track the flow of oil, wool, and bronze through the palace gates. It was the code that ran the logistical operating system. As the physical nodes of the palaces are torched, the administrative class, the only individuals who can read the code, are liquidated. There is no longer a system to account for, so the medium of accounting becomes obsolete in a single generation. This is the most terrifying cost of extreme specialization, the loss of collective memory. Because the empires had optimized their intellectual labor into a tiny, elite caste of scribes. The collapse of the infrastructure leads to a total intellectual blackout. As the clay tablets are baked hard in the fires of the falling cities, they preserve the final, desperate inventory of a dying world, lists of missing oarsmen and watchers by the sea. Beyond these fragments, there is a 400-year silence. The technology of writing is not just forgotten, it is discarded as a useless relic of a complexity that no longer exists. The transition is brutal and mechanical. The surviving population regresses to a localized, oral culture. Without the ability to store information outside the human brain, the scale of cooperation collapses from the continental to the tribal. The energy cost of maintaining a literate society is too high when every calorie must be spent on the immediate filtration of water and the gathering of fuel. We are witnessing the de-skilling of a species. The sophisticated metallurgical knowledge required to forge bronze is lost, replaced by the crude, difficult, but locally sourced iron. The system has shifted from a high-fidelity, fragile network to a low-fidelity, resilient wreckage. The system survives this intellectual liquidation only by simplifying to a level where no data is required to keep the body alive. The collapse of the tin network creates a technological vacuum that forces a desperate, mechanical pivot. Iron is everywhere, it is the grit in the soil and the rust in the hills, but it is a nightmare to process. It requires a massive increase in thermal energy, demanding furnaces that can reach 1538 degrees C, a heat intensity that the Bronze Age systems were never designed to contain. For centuries, iron was a garbage metal, a brittle byproduct that could not compete with the smooth, castable efficiency of bronze. Now, with the trade veins severed, it is the only path left. This shift is not progress, it is a retreat into local friction. Bronze could be melted and poured into intricate, repeatable molds, allowing for the mass production of standardized components. Iron must be hammered. It requires the physical, repetitive labor of the blacksmith, pounding out impurities grain by grain. This is the destandardization of the world. The shift to iron forces a collapse in the scale of manufacturing. You can no longer equip an army from a single central palace, you must rely on scattered, inefficient workshops. The energy cost per unit of hardware skyrockets while the quality of the output drops. The system is forced to simplify its material requirements because it can no longer afford the logistical tax of perfection. The Iron Age begins not with a discovery, but with a shortage. We see this mechanical downgrade in every collapsing system. When the high-performance fuel runs out, we revert to the dirty, local coal. When the global chip supply fractures, we return to the analog. The move to iron represents the liquidation of precision. We trade the elegant, integrated bronze sword for a crude, heavy iron blade, not because the iron is better, but because the bronze is impossible. The system survives this technological regression, but only by accepting a world that is fractured, localized, and significantly more violent. The most brutal friction of the collapse is the biological load. The Bronze Age empires were not just political entities, they were massive caloric redistribution engines. By specializing in export commodities like olive oil, wine, and textiles to pay for their Internet of Metals, they had outgrown the carrying capacity of their local soil. They were importing their survival. When the trade veins rupture, the calories stop moving. The mechanism of failure shifts from the shipyard to the stomach. As the grain shipments from the Nile and the Black Sea cease to arrive, the urban centers become death traps. The energy cost of staying in a city becomes lethal. In the Greek peninsula, the population density hemorrhages by nearly 75%. This is not just due to violence, but to the total failure of the filtration and distribution systems that kept thousands of people hydrated and fed in concentrated areas. The survivors flee the coasts, retreating into the marginal zones, the harsh, inaccessible mountains where the land is poor but the visibility is high. They trade the wealth of the sea for the security of the cliffside. This is the biological liquidation of the system. The complex social hierarchy, the kings, the tax collectors, the architects, is a luxury that requires a massive caloric surplus to maintain. In the absence of that surplus, the system sheds its human complexity. The elite class is the first to be cannibalized by the chaos, followed by the specialized craftsmen who no longer have a market for their skills. The Mediterranean basin becomes a silent, de-urbanized landscape. We are witnessing the final cost of efficiency. When you optimize for growth, you remove the buffers that allow you to survive a lean year. The system survives this demographic collapse by shrinking its footprint, leaving the massive stone palaces to be reclaimed by the grit and the weeds as monuments to a scale that can no longer be sustained. For the survivors, the world becomes a graveyard of incomprehensible scale. They graze sheep in the ruins of the Lion Gate at Mycenae, staring at stones so massive, some weighing over 20 tons, that they conclude only a race of one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes, could have moved them. This is the amnesia phase. When a system collapses, it leaves behind a physical shell that the subsequent simplified society can no longer operate, repair, or even conceptualize. The energy cost to move those stones has vanished from the human record, leaving only the structural shadow of a lost capacity. This ghost infrastructure creates a psychological friction. The people of the Dark Ages live in the negative space of a high-technology civilization. They scavenge bronze from the ruins, melting down the masterpieces of their ancestors to make crude iron-tipped plows or basic arrowheads. This is the ultimate liquidation. The cultural and structural capital of 3 centuries is recycled into the raw materials of survival. The knowledge of how to build such things doesn't just fade, it becomes a burden. To try to maintain a palace when you're struggling to find clean water is a form of mechanical insanity. We see the same mechanism in our own aging power grids and crumbling concrete bridges. We are increasingly surrounded by structures we can no longer afford to replicate. The cost of the Great Reset is the realization that the world we inhabit is a loan from a more complex past. As the technical skill sets fracture, the ruins stop being assets and start being obstacles, grit in the machinery of the new, smaller reality. The survivors are not building a new world, they are cannibalizing the corpse of the old one to postpone their own extinction. The system survives as a scavenger culture, existing in the cracks of a foundation it can no longer understand, waiting for the memory of the Internet of Bronze to turn into a myth. The Bronze Age collapse was not a single event. It was a slow-motion mechanical failure of a global system that had optimized itself for a speed it couldn't sustain. 5 empires did not die of old age, they died of connectivity. They built a world so integrated that a single broken link in a tin mine 5,000 miles away could trigger a total biological and intellectual liquidation. We look at their ruins and see a primitive tragedy. But the physics of the connectivity trap haven't changed. We have simply replaced the tin routes with rare earth mineral supply chains, and the signal fires with undersea fiber optic cables. We have increased the pressure, tightened the margins, and removed the buffers. Our system is faster, more efficient, and more tightly coupled than the Mycenaean palaces ever were. As the heat of our own globalized friction rises, we must ask, are we building a world that can heal, or are we just perfecting the mechanism of a more spectacular collapse? The signal fires remain unlit. The harbor is silent. The pressure is still rising.